Hey guys, Clayton with Springfield Leather here. Today we wanted to go over some edge finishing techniques for your finished product. So you probably get all the way through your finished product and maybe you still have some raw edges that you'd like to take care of, slick down, and maybe add a little color to. So we're going to go over 3 or 4 processes today that'll kind of give you the basics of finishing a raw edge on veg tan and oil tan. Starting out, we're going to use this all drum dyed veg tan wallet, right, inside and out. Same leather throughout. And I'm going to show you how to finish the raw edge with by finish sanding it with a high grit sandpaper and water, so wet sanding the edge, and then gum tragging and burnishing with a burnishing cloth. So we'll start out, we'll get the edge a little bit wet. There's Denny's spray bottle here. He's on vacation and he's always got the best tools. Loves it when I borrow them. So we're just going to get the edge a little bit wet here. And what this does is, as you're sanding it with the sandpaper, really helps lay down those fibers well, especially if you're using something like 600 grit sandpaper like we have here. I'm just going to fold that over. We'll hit the top edge. It really doesn't take too much. You'll really feel it start to smooth out and actually start to burnish the edge a little bit since you're using such a fine grit. You can take this down in steps if you want to. Start with, once you get the edge flush, you can start with about 220, use 400 or 600 to really smooth it out like this. This will get you a nice professional edge once you're done. So right now it's already pretty smooth, but we're going to want to lay down those fibers a little bit more and kind of make it water resistant. So for that, like I said, we're going to use a product called Gum Tragacanth, or Gum Trag for short. I've got our big gallon of it here. Dump a little bit there, and I just use a sponge to apply it, just the corner of a sponge. You can be pretty liberal with it. It doesn't really stain your leather too bad. You might be a little bit more careful if you're using like an unfinished natural veg. But if you get a little bit on the front, then I just get it all over the front and disguise any marks it'll leave behind. So like I said, I was pretty liberal. Lay it on kind of thick, make sure the edge is still wet. And then we'll use one of these canvas cloths. This is just natural canvas. And just rub back and forth like you did with the sandpaper. You'll start to feel some friction build up, and then it'll start to get slick again and start getting shiny, and that's when you know you're getting a good burnish. You can get an edge that just looks like glass. You can kind of see the shine on that. Now that's completely dry at this point. All that friction and heat we built up really dries it out and gets you a nice smooth edge. We can do the same thing to this side. Got another raw edge here. Kind of wet it down. Get some water to soak into it. Sand it again with our 600 grit sandpaper. And put a little gum trag on it. Again, you just get a nice high gloss edge. It's just as smooth as glass. Can't ask for much more. Now the key to getting a good edge on this stuff is making sure you do a good job sanding. You get all of your layers of leather flush on the edge, and you know, maybe run over it with a beveler so you don't have any sharp edges that you're trying to push down. That gum trag and wet sanding works great on vegetable tan leather. Another method, if you want to add a little bit of color to your edge first, I've got another little card wallet here that's made out of some different drum dyed veg tan leather. So another method, if you want, like I said, if you want to add color to it, I'm going to go ahead and wet the edge of this like we did before and finish sand it. Kind of a good starting point. Alright, so now we got our edge sanded. I'll show you what the bottom edge looks like. It's still nice, it's still rough. You know, the edges they're flushed up for the most part, but you can see the fiber standing up and it's a lot lighter color. Once you've wet sanded it, it'll be much smoother and much slicker to the feel. Alright, so we're going to go on to edge dyeing it. And so for this, I'm just using a regular Phoebing's leather dye. We're going to go ahead and put on some gloves so I don't stain my hands. I get a little siphon lid off. And this is just straight undiluted dye. It's going to make your edge pretty dark. You can dilute your dye 50-50 with alcohol if you wish, depending on what color of leather you're trying to match it to. And anytime you're using regular leather dye on edges, you want to make sure that you're using a matching color to whatever leather you're doing. I wouldn't recommend trying to do this on a natural veg or anything like that because it's just going to bleed over to the front, right? So we got our edge that we've sanded down smooth. I'm going to go ahead and carefully dye it. Hopefully keep it from bleeding onto the front or anywhere else. We'll go ahead and dye the other edges too, even though we haven't sanded them yet. We'll just kind of have a good comparison as how finish sanding really benefits your edge finish. Alright, so we've got our edges dyed with the leather dye. We're going to go ahead and apply the gum trag and burnish them out. Alright, so we got our edges dyed and gum trag and burnished with the canvas cloth. So you can see on one side that we finished sanded here with this fine grit sandpaper. The edges are a little more rounded, the layers are a little more uniform and flush, and it's slicked down a little bit better. And then as opposed to this side, which we didn't finish sand, we just dyed and gum tragged and burnished. the corners aren't quite as rounded over. It just doesn't quite have as much of a professional look. Not quite as slick either to the touch. All right, so next we're going to talk about edge painting. Edge painting starts off much the same way. You want to finish sand your edges, but a lot of times whenever you're painting edges, it's because you can't get a good burnish on it, and that's usually because it's oil tan. Some oil tans are pretty firm, and you can still burnish them with a product like gum trag and get the fibers to slick down pretty well. A lot of times, anytime you try to burnish or apply any force to the edge of oil tan, you're just going to mush those edges over, end up with a flat edge or sharp edges, things like that. So I'm going to show you guys how I paint an edge, how I prep it and get it painted, and hopefully have the most professional look possible. It's not always easy, and it's not real fast, but if you want good results, it does take time. Now this check wallet here, or checkbook cover, that's got some pretty rough edges right now, so we're going to take a minute and finish sand those edges, get them slicked down. The slicker and smoother surface you can start with, the better that your painted edge will turn out to be. All right, so let's start a little bit heavier sandpaper here. You'll notice that I'm not actually wet sanding this leather. That's because it is an oil tan. It's got oils and waxes in the leather, so it's not going to accept water like a vegetable tan will. Get any excess fibers off that you can. Make sure it's not all dusty still. We're going to paint the edges of this with a bone color Angelus paint. That way it'll show up real good for the video. Anytime you're doing a light or contrasting color of paint onto your leather, it can be kind of challenging because any little mistake's going to show up. So we're going to do our best here. And hopefully we've got a decent looking product at the end. So the first coat of paint that goes onto your edge is really most of it's gonna soak into the leather. So you can go over it, try to put down kind of, a medium coat, nothing too heavy, because you're gonna wanna let it dry, and then your subsequent coats are really gonna be what stands up and forms a nice smooth edge. The first coats can be pretty rough. I like to use these little rectangular sponge applicators. And really, it's just, the name of the game is being as careful as you can. And keep your lines straight. And I like to keep plenty of paint on my sponge. That way you don't have to apply too much downward pressure and you're not trying to push paint onto it, because that's where you start to get your lines off up over the edge of the leather. If you notice you're kind of getting over the edge on certain parts, go ahead and just wipe it off the edge there. See if you can take care of it before it dries. You'll be much better off. We can always go back and kind of dress it up later a little bit, but all right, so we just got done putting our first coat of paint onto our oil tan check presenter, or not check presenter, checkbook cover. All right, so after you put on your first coat of paint, it's still going to feel kind of rough. You know, you're not going to have good coverage. It takes multiple coats. So after your first coat is completely dry, we're going to go ahead and finish sand it with some of our 600 grit sandpaper. And it'll feel like you're kind of just taking off what you just did, but really the first coat goes a long ways to help stiffen the edge, lay down the fibers, and make way for the next couple coats of paint. So I'm just kind of lightly sanding the edges. I'm going to be careful not to get the sandpaper on top of your leather. Just to the point to where they're nice and smooth. You kind of want to wipe off some of the dust. Make sure it's a good clean edge. Now, from your first coat, you might notice you have kind of a wiggly line. You don't have a very clean line on your edge. And an easy way to take care of that is just with your fine grit sandpaper. That's what's nice about having something like 600 grit, is you can sand up on the edge a little bit to take off those squiggly lines without taking the grain off your leather. It comes off pretty easily. It really helps clean up your paint lines. Got a nice straight line again. Inside looks good, so we're going to go ahead and apply our second coat of paint. Now, if you remember, I applied the first coat with one of these rectangular sponge applicators. That's just a personal preference. I think it does pretty well. Subsequent coats of paint, kind of hard to say. I like to use this little tool, this paint roller. Now, it's a little bit tricky, takes a little practice to use, but it helps you lay down a real thick coat, and that way you don't have to do quite as many by wiping it on. So the key here is to get a fair bit of paint onto your roller, just enough to where it's not going to drip, and start gently rolling it on. Like I said, it's a little tricky to keep at the same angle. You can always go back and clean up your lines later if you need to. You can see that applies a nice thick coat of paint. Help you get that nice professional kind of built up edge. So that's not going to be the end of your process. Painting edges and getting a nice smooth edge is all about painting, sanding, and repeat. Paint it, sand it with a fine grit sandpaper, put another coat on it, and keep going until you're satisfied. We're done with that one. We're going to move on and show you another edge product that I like, and I've used for quite a few years, but not a lot of people seem to know about it. Phoebing's Wax Burnishing Ink, or Burnishing Ink Wax, as we like to call it. This stuff is pretty cool. So it's an ink or a dye, but it's got a wax content, so after you apply it, you're able to burnish it with like a canvas cloth, and it'll slick down the fibers and give you a nice smooth edge. We've got a belt I grabbed off retail here. Just a plain one of our $20 belts. It's got beveled edges, but no finish on them. So I'm going to show you guys how this ink wax works on this belt. It's just a finished veg tan. Go ahead and get a little bit of this ink wax ready. You can see it's not quite as thin as a regular leather dye, but it's not as thick as a paint either. So I like to use the sponge applicator again. And of course, like I said before, the key to any nice finished edge is sanding. So I went ahead and I finished sanding these edges with the 600 grit sandpaper again. Just kind of going around them lightly to get some of those loose fibers off and smooth them down and get a little bit finer edge to start with. Let's go ahead and take the buckle off this. All right, we're going to start right here. And you just apply it just like you would a dye or a paint. Be careful of your front edges. If you get a little bit over, just go ahead and wipe it off before it dries and it should be just fine. So we just finished up applying our ink wax to both edges of the belt. So we're going to let this dry for just a second, and then we're going to hit it with a canvas cloth and burnish it just like we did with the gum trag. What's nice about this, instead of using a regular edge dye or regular leather dye for the edges, this has got a wax content, being burnishing ink wax, so it'll slick the fibers down and get you a nice slick edge. So I'll just take my canvas, run it down both edges. Now you can see it already starts to slick it down with a nice smooth edge. So that takes us to our last edge finishing technique. We wanted to show you guys a technique we like to use in our shop a lot. I've got one of our unfinished conceal and carry belts here with me, and you can see it's got a natural edge. We've got natural veg on the back and drum dyed on the face of the belt. And so you can see the two layers together, just natural leather, nothing on them. So we're going to take this over to the shop and show you how we do it on the finisher. So at the finisher, once we get it fired up, we apply our neutral Yankee wax. We load up this leather wheel that you can see as it's spinning, and once we have that, we've got a little leather slider we like to slide the belt through and push the belt up against the leather wheel to start burnishing the edge, and you'll start to see it darken here. We'll go over it 3 or 4 times until it's good, loaded with wax, and we've got a nice dark burnished edge. And then we'll take it over to the horsehair brush wheel, knock off any excess wax, and buff it to a high gloss. Alright, so that wraps it up. We showed you guys 5 different edge finishing techniques. Hopefully you guys got some good stuff out of it. If you have any questions, for sure, comment, smash the like button. Let us know how we're doing. Thanks guys, have a good one.